Welcome back to another edition of the Mintcast, the podcast from MintPress News. This is the show that goes deeper than just the headlines and brings you quality discussions on the biggest and most important topics concerning the world. This show is viewer and listener supported, as we have no billionaire or state backers. So if you are in a position to help us grow, please do go to Indiegogo and check out our campaign there, support us there. The link will be down below there. Now, we often deal with topics that can feel quite depressing here at MintPress News, but Latin America often feels like a bit of a shining light of progress, with social movements electing wave after wave of radical governments across the region. Of course, the US is still very much has its eyes on the region that Joe Biden called America's front yard. So here to discuss Latin America Rising is Ollie Vargas. Ollie is an award-winning journalist and reporter, the co-founder of Kawsachun News, a Bolivian outlet that publishes in English as well, so check that out too. He's also published from MintPress News. Welcome to the show, Ollie.
No, thank you, Alan, for inviting me on. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, great to talk to you again. I'm sure we're going to touch on a ton of things happening across the region, but don't worry, viewers, if you haven't been paying close attention, we'll try and keep things simple and understandable for everyone, even though that's perhaps not so easy when we're talking about all of these places. I wanted to start with Ecuador, if I could. It's in the news right now with presidential elections underway. The unpopular president, Guillermo Lasso, is set to depart after dissolving the country's National Assembly in May. There is a leftist candidate, Luisa Gonzalez, who is leading the polls, but the situation right now is really far from clear. Adding more drama to the election was the assassination of one of the chief presidential candidates, Fernando Villavicencio, last week. Could you tell us a bit more about what's going on and what's at stake at Ecuador, and perhaps what path Ecuador has gone down in the past few years under Lasso as well?
Yeah, it's really hotting up in Ecuador because they're holding emergency elections, sort of snap elections, as say in the UK, at the end of this month, and then the second round of those elections will be at the end of October. I think there will most likely will be a second round, so the definitive result will be at the end of October. But it's getting very tense because, as you said last week, there's a murder of one of the candidates, Fernando Villavicencio, who's a right-wing candidate. He was a right-wing journalist. Most of his campaign, although he's not on the ticket of with the current ruling party, current ruling figures, he was a sort of opposition candidate. He was in around fourth, fifth place in the polls throughout the past few months. But the centerpiece of his campaign was attacking the left, not criticizing the current party and current government in power. Is focused on attacking the Correistas party, the Citizens Revolution, and their candidate, Luisa and Andres Arauz, who people might remember was the presidential candidate in 2021 when there was elections then. And yeah, it's the line that the media is using now following the death is to try and take political advantage of this death to say, bring up old tweets from Korea, criticizing this journalist, say, well, look, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Do you think this guy was the one who ordered this hit? And of course, there's no confirmed information at all proving that. The only person that was arrested at the scene died in police custody within a few hours. So there's almost no confirmed information in regards to what actually happened. But this is definitely going to sort of, make the whole elections a lot more tense. But in my opinion, this murder really shines a light on how bad the situation has gotten in Ecuador, especially on questions of security, rise in violent crime. The homicide rate in Ecuador has risen over 500% ever since Rafael Correa left power in 2017. And since 2017, we've had the return of neoliberal policies, privatization, deals with the IMF, all of this sort of thing. And the poverty that's created has led to a huge rise in crime. Under Correa, Ecuador had the second lowest homicide rate in South America. It now has one of the highest anywhere in the world. as I said, a 500% increase since 2017 to today. And that's something I used to live in Ecuador myself. It's something that you see on the streets. It's a huge concern. Huge numbers of Ecuadorians are leaving the country as well, migrating out. The largest growing group of people crossing the Darien Gap, which is this sort of jungle area in Panama, which is migrants going to the United States on foot. The largest growing group of people crossing that are Ecuadorians. So this is triggered as well a migrant crisis, both in the region and at the US border. So the situation in Ecuador has really deteriorated since 2017, and that's why there's so much at stake in these elections.
Yeah, you mentioned somebody who some viewers might not know too much about, Rafael Correa there. He was the president from 2007 to 2017, and he's still a very, very popular figure in the country. Even though he's been persecuted by successive governments, he doesn't even live in Ecuador anymore. Yeah, he managed to reduce poverty in his 10 years in power by 38%, and he halved extreme poverty. I know he doubled social spending, particularly in education and in health and in housing. And I think he was more or less able to do this because he really took on the international banking groups like the IMF and just refused to pay Ecuador's odious debts. He also managed to nationalize the country's oil sector, which was, partially nationalized before, but really it was the oil revenues that jumped up extraordinarily during his time. He played hardball with the Western multinationals. He managed to change the country's oil revenues from 13% of total revenues that were coming out of the ground to 87%, which really annoyed people in Washington and London and Paris, etc. So yeah, I think Correa and his movement, the Correistas, certainly have a lot of public goodwill still in Ecuador. And as I said, his successor, or I don't know if you want to call her that, but Luisa Gonzalez is indeed still number one in the polls right now. But I saw recently that you tweeted something about the US government having signed an agreement to train Ecuador's military, which you kind of suggested that could be some pretty shady business that they might be preparing for a coup. Do you think that's likely? And has US interventionism in Latin America reduced, or is it alive and well as ever?
Absolutely. I think it's very suspicious that 1 month for historic elections, crucial elections in which I think the stakes could not be higher for the country. The 1 month before that, they signed this wide-ranging military agreement for military cooperation, which the United States will be training Ecuadorian troops. And as we know, viewers may know or may not know, that Ecuador has a recent history of coups. In 2008-9, Rafael Correa himself, during his first period in office, suffered a coup. He was taken hostage, kidnapped, and then returned to power when the people of Ecuador came to the streets and essentially, erected barricades, went on strike, and made the country ungovernable for the sort of police-led coup that had taken place against Rafael Correa. And Correa was able to return to power. So Ecuador has a history of coups. It has a history of a very repressive security force that's been used constantly the past few years. I saw it, with my own eyes when I lived in Ecuador, when there were anti-IMF protests, brutal repression against protesters there. I saw the, coffins being carried out of indigenous leaders that were killed during those days of protests in 2019. And then there's been a number of others, these mass mobilizations since then. So I think it's something to keep an eye on. It's something I think that will be of concern for if the left is able to win these elections. They will be now inheriting security forces that are in that moment still under intense cooperation with the United States, both ideologically and in matters of training, etc. And so, it's a huge concern, of course, the manner in which the left in Latin America has been able to take governmental power through elections, but found taking other institutions of the state whether it's the military, whether it's the judiciary, they found that much more difficult. We've seen that countries like Argentina, where while Cristina Kirchner, you know, the figurehead of the left in Argentina, is the current sitting vice president, still being persecuted by the courts of our country through on totally spurious grounds. And that's because the judiciary is still in the hands of the old ruling elites, the old neoliberal elites, and those institutional blockages was huge problems for the left in power.
Yeah, most definitely. And so many of these army officers across Latin America are actually trained in the US at the School of the Americas, or whatever it keeps renaming itself, the WINSEC now, I believe it's called. And this is an organization that's trained, I believe, 84,000 Latin American officers, whether they're police or military. And they train them specifically to go after what they say communists, which really means basically democracy advocates, so trade unionists, politicians, etc. And that really creates such a culture of fear within Latin America, and really a culture of like looking out for any or all sorts of dissent among Latin America's military. And they see themselves as really having to stamp that out. And we've seen so many coups over the past, well, pick a date, 20 years in Latin America, which have had US either direct involvement or quiet involvement, whether it's in Venezuela in 2002, or the wave of counter-revolutionary violence in the 2010s, or the Bay of Piglets invasion that happened not so long ago in Venezuela, or the judicial coup against Fernando Lugo in Paraguay in 2012, or how the US helped oust President Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2016. Nicaragua, Bolivia, there was a secessionist movement there that the US supported. I mean, we can go on and on and on. But yeah, I think pretty clear that the United States has not given up its ambitions on trying to control that part of the world. But yeah, I guess the United States is a bit more laser focused on Russia and China right now. And I guess that's really the issue that's dominated much of North American politics for the last 18 months. In a way, that's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What has Latin America made of the Russia-Ukraine war? Have they taken sides? What's the prevailing attitude there, do you think?
The prevailing attitude from the very beginning and still today is one of official neutrality. It's particularly with the economic crisis that has come out, particularly following the Western sanctions on Russia that disrupted the energy markets and a number of other industries. Latin America has suffered enormously, and national governments, whether left or right, are much more focused on their domestic issues than having an official position on issues on issues going on in Europe. And that has been the case from the very beginning. The only government that has been very, very vocal about supporting one side has been the government of Chile under President Gabriel Boric, who I would define as a liberal centrist president. And he's been very, very vocal in his support for Ukraine. He's held a number of meetings, virtual meetings with Zelensky, has brought up the issue at international forums, at the UN, at Latin American regional forums. But in terms of, for example, supplying arms to Ukraine, there's not been any of that within from Latin America. Of course, Latin American governments are allied to the United States. They are recipients of military aid from the United States. So there's nothing that they would be able to give Ukraine, even if they wanted to, because they are they are themselves armed by the United States. And from countries that we can define as broadly, left governments, some Venezuela, Bolivia, etc., there has been a continuation of relations with Russia. They haven't, pronounced them, given an official position in regards to the conflict in Ukraine, but they have continued friendly relations with Russia, much to, of course, to something that has upset the State Department, but those relations have continued. And recently, a few months ago, in May, at the end of May, there was an official visit from Sergei Lavrov, of course, the foreign minister of Russia he did a Latin America tour, went to Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Brazil. And the foreign minister of Bolivia as well met Lavrov in Venezuela, in Caracas. And so those relationships have been maintained despite the conflict. I'd say, just in terms of just on a societal level, especially, this past month, I've been in Europe, and the sort of public discussion around Russia, around Ukraine, is so different to that in Latin America. In Latin America, there's not a demonization of Russia, of Russians, Russian culture that exists in Europe and North America. Watching RT is not a criminal offense in the way it seems to be in Europe. In fact, in Europe, you can't even see RT. Can't log into the website. Can't see its social media channels. It's been blocked. Whereas in Latin America, for example, before YouTube took down the channel of RT in Spanish, that was actually the number one news channel in Spanish language news channel on YouTube, higher than CNN Spanish, higher than Telemundo, any of these organizations. So there's a different perception. It's something that doesn't dominate the news cycles. If you turn on the BBC in the UK or anywhere else in Europe, you'll find constant discussion about Russia, about Ukraine. That doesn't exist in Latin America. People are much more focused on, I would say, the economic crisis that has been triggered ever since the energy markets were disrupted following sanctions.
How has that affected Latin America then economically?
Well, it's had a huge effect. It's almost that the majority of Latin American countries have subsidized fuel, and the rise in oil prices has, even for countries that produce oil, has put strains on national budgets, because they now have to increase subsidies on fuel, because if fuel prices rise in Latin America, that's when riots happen, that's when cars start being burnt down, that's when government buildings start being burnt down. So maintaining fuel prices has been a real challenge. Where fuel prices have risen, there's been huge protests. We've seen that for example, in Peru last year. Another very serious problem has been access to fertilizers. Of course, Russia and Ukraine are both some of the world's leading exporters of fertilizers, and the disruption has been caused since the conflict and the sanctions has meant that there's the price of fertilizer has shot up massively, and Latin America, almost vast majority of Latin American countries do not produce their own fertilizer, and they imported it, and so that the price of that going up means prices go up for farmers, means that rising prices of food, therefore inflation. So there's a very serious problem. One exception to that would be Bolivia, that had, ever since the government of Evo Morales, built a state-owned fertilizer factory. And that's something actually that any country with natural gas, which is many Latin American countries, could do. Fertilizers made using natural gas. However, in a free market economy, of course, there is no incentive to industrialize these natural resources. It's much easier to export primary raw materials to the West, who then make their own industrialized added value product, finished value product, which they then sell back to countries like Latin America. That's what we call an unequal trade relationship, a dependency trade relationship. Whereas in Bolivia, where there's been state investments in publicly owned industries, they were able to build their own fertilizer plants. So, of course, things like this have a huge ripple effect across the whole economy. Of course, fertilizer is not something people think about every day, but when it comes to food, it has a huge effect on prices. It's certainly had a very destabilizing effect in Latin America. And I think we're going to see that play out in a lot of the elections that are going to be coming up this year in Ecuador, in Argentina, which are going to be crucial for the future of the region.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Gabriel Boric a couple of minutes ago. I wanted to ask you about him as well because, yeah, he was heralded by a lot of people in the West as a new kind of progressive. But I noticed you've been very critical of him. What did you call him? A radical centrist or something? Why is that? Where do you think he fits on that sort of political scale in Latin America?
Well, Boric is someone who came out of the student movements in Chile. Um, I would say middle class student movements within Chile. He's not someone who comes out from, for example, the socialist left or from trade unions or indigenous movements, etc. And I would define his ideology as a liberal centrist. He has taken positions that will probably be considered more progressive than much of the Latin American left on questions like LGBT issues, like feminism, things like this. When it comes to economic issues, he represents absolutely a continuity with the old conservative free market government of Chile, which, at one point in the early 2000s was the most unequal country in the whole world, under the socialist president of Michelle Bachelet. Of course, the Socialist Party in Chile is very much like the Socialist Party of France or of Spain, in that they have become liberal organizations in a sort of new labor type model. And Boric is certainly a continuation of that. On foreign policy issues, attached himself to Zelensky, constantly talking about Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, attacking them more so than right wing governments of the region and out conservative governments of the region. Something that's he's preoccupied with himself with to a massive extent. I would say performatively, and and there's been a certain lauding, for example, in some outside of Chile about the so-called nationalization of lithium. In fact, there was no nationalization of lithium in Chile, which is currently the largest exporter of primary raw material, which is, say, salt, essentially digging up salt and selling that to countries like Australia, who then make their own lithium batteries. Chile is the primary exporter of that. None of that will be touched. All existing contracts with foreign corporations will remain in place. It's only on new exploration that will be publicly owned. Of course, that's something that's very positive and will bring in revenues for Chile. But the existing, which is the majority of Chile's lithium mining, is done privately by foreign corporations. They don't have a strategy, for example, as Mexico or Bolivia is building, with industrializing lithium. That is to say, not just exporting salt for pennies, but actually creating lithium batteries within your country. And that can only be done through state-led investment, of course. But for Gabriel Boric, he has maintained, he represents a continuity of the free market model of his predecessor, Sebastián Piñera, and the predecessor before that, and the one before that.
Yeah, I guess that is a key part of what you really need to do to be an independent country in Latin America, which is have this sort of import substitution and state-led economic growth. But yeah, I guess another thing is Latin American unity is what is needed as well. And over the past few years, we've seen a lot of people all over the global south, but particularly in Latin America, talk more about multipolarity, which basically means a world that wouldn't be purely dominated by the United States. One measure of this is all of the countries that are currently applying or thinking about applying to join the economic bloc, BRICS. Aside from Brazil, which is already in it, we've seen Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, and I think more Latin American countries considering applying for this. What's going on in Latin America with regard to actually building a multipolar world or a Latin American unity like that?
Well, certainly, I think the election of Lula da Silva in Brazil last year is key for that. There's always been the aspiration there, but I think without the leadership of Brazil, which is of course the largest country in Latin America, the largest economy, without the leadership of Brazil, it's very difficult to make it a reality. And of course, under Bolsonaro, Brazil had, I would define it as an isolationist foreign policy, in that they were not interested in cooperation with the rest of Latin America. When Donald Trump was president, they had a very close relationship with the United States. When Trump left office, they turned away from the United States and had almost, I think Bolsonaro, you could say, had almost no allies, no international allies by the time he left power, which is why I think his plans to carry out a coup against the election results was something that never came to fruition, never materialized, because he did not have that international support, because he had turned inwards, essentially. That was the policy of Brazil under Bolsonaro, to just turn inwards and not look to the rest of South America, not look to build a South America or Latin America bloc. And without that leadership from Brazil, it is hard to make that a reality, because their economy is so much bigger than many of the other countries. Now that Lula, of course, has taken power, Brazil is back on the world stage. They've recently held the Amazon Summit to protect the Amazon with the governments that have the Amazon rainforest in the national territory. Lula's been a voice, a Latin American voice on behalf of Latin America, attempting to broker a peace between Russia and Ukraine. He's presented a peace plan to both Russia and Ukraine. He has called for an end to sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela, and believes in an end to the isolation that those countries have faced when Bolsonaro was in power. So I think that's certainly very positive for a future of Latin American integration. But the situation is also very unstable. We're going to have at the end of October, elections in Argentina, which is the second largest economy in South America. And frankly, we don't know what could happen there. In Argentina, under the current president, Alberto Fernandez, someone who has applied to join BRICS and who believes in the project that Lula is building, has been a close ally of Lula. That government is now currently very weak. It's a government that has failed to really challenge the IMF, and failure to challenge the IMF and failure to cancel the bad debt that was built up by the former neoliberal president Mauricio Macri has caused Argentina's problems of inflation, etc., to get much worse in the past few years. And now he's unlikely to be re-elected in October. Inflation has reached 100% annual inflation now going into these elections. So it's very hard to envision someone of his party, because he's not standing for re-election, but someone of his party to continue that project. And what we've seen last night, at the time of recording this, so when this will be posted, but at the time of recording this, last night, there was primary elections in Argentina. And the participation in the primaries gives us an idea of which party has the largest number of voters. And in that, we saw the candidate Javier Milei, who is a self-described libertarian, almost anarcho-capitalist candidate, come first. And in second place, traditional conservatives, neoliberals, and in third place, the Peronist candidate. So, and the Javier Milei, who is at the moment riding high in first place, he is someone who believes in dollarizing Argentina's economy, just doing away with the Argentinian peso, taking up the US dollar as the national currency. He's someone who believes in, that does not believe in a project that includes countries like Brazil, like Russia, like China. He believes in a turn towards the United States. And so as Brazil assumes leadership, Argentina presents a question mark over that and how much of a role countries like Argentina are playing. But there's a number of other countries that still believe in this project. Bolivia has applied to join a new BRICS Plus, for example, and there is certainly a lot of will. There's been incredible leadership, for example, from President Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico on all of these issues as well. But it's a very chaotic situation, I would say, at the moment, and one that we're not going to really have a concrete answer about probably until the end of 2023.
It is amazing listening to you thinking about just how much is at stake in every election in Latin America. It's so different from so many countries in the West, actually. But yeah, I did want to talk about Andrés Manuel López Obrador a bit, actually. He's one of these new leaders that's also pushing for a multipolar world. The president of Mexico, AMLO, as he's known, he's really ruffled a lot of feathers in Washington and indeed in Mexico as well. but he's also got quite a big support base internally. What's going on in Mexico under AMLO? Why is he managing to stay so popular?
Yeah, I mean, it's very impressive. Throughout his time in power, his approval rating has never dipped below around 65%. A lot of people I speak to in Mexico say the real figure of his approval rating would be, over 70%, making him essentially the most popular president of the Americas. Um, Very recently, we've had one Nayib Bukele perhaps overtake him, but that's a special case. But Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, over the years he's been in power, ever since 2018, 2019, sorry, from the 2018 to 2019 period, has been consistently the most popular leader in the whole of the Americas. And um, if you read foreign correspondents based in Mexico City, they'll constantly say, scratching their heads about how this could happen, despite the fact they live in Mexico and have the opportunity to speak to Mexicans. They clearly do not do that. But if you look at the facts, President AMLO has massively raised the minimum wage, kept inflation low, massively raised state pensions. That's something that when I was in Mexico a couple of years ago, people told me constantly, because it meant that, elderly family members could live with dignity for the first time. And that, also had an effect of lightening financial burdens on extended family, on their children, who often in Mexico had to support their elderly parents, because there was no other support systems in place at the time throughout the whole neoliberal period. And now under President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, there is a infrastructure, or better infrastructure, in place now. And so things like this is ways that people's lives have been changed in material ways. I think he's a president as well that has contact with people, that has much more direct communication with people. He has a press conference, for example, every morning where he addresses every issue of the day, whereas Mexico presidents that preceded him were aloft, were stood above the population rather than with the population. So I think people really appreciate that constant communication they get with the president. And yeah, this, as we've seen, this isn't up and down situation. He has been consistently for years now, from the very beginning of his presidency, has been polling, not going below around 65%, and that's an incredible achievement in Latin America, where we often see highs and troughs for many leaders, but he is one that stood out, that has had that consistency and consistently been the most popular leader in the Americas. And now, of course, he's rolling out plans for the nationalization and industrialization of lithium, which is incredibly popular among Mexicans. And then at the end of this year, we're going to have elections there as well in in Mexico. And Mexico has a sort of funny system in which you can't stand for re-election even once. So you serve a 6-year term and then you have to leave office. And so the main kind of political question now in Mexico is who's going to succeed him. And rather, I should say, the primary elections within his party, Morena, who's going to be the candidate for Morena, because whoever the candidate for Morena is extremely, extremely likely to be the new president. Because the old neoliberal parties, the PRI, who have been in and out of power for 100 years, literally, the PAN, the Conservative PAN, PAN, they are nowhere to be seen in the polls. The hegemony that Andres Manuel has built over his time is extraordinary, and I think whoever he backs will win re-election. And that's going to be quite interesting. We've got two sort of candidates there. One, Claudia Sheinbaum, who represents the sort of the left within the party. And on the other hand, the Foreign Minister, Marcelo Ebrard, who represents, I think, the right of within Morena, within Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador's party. And those two are going to battle it out. And that's going to be the biggest issue in Mexico going forward, is which of those two will be the candidate. Whoever's the candidate, very likely to be president.
AMLO's also been really critical of the US throughout his time in office, hasn't he? He's, told America to its face that it's not really a democracy. It's also been just lacerating the US-led drug war as well. What is your position on what the US is doing vis-a-vis drugs across Latin America? I do know a lot of Latin Americans are quite skeptical of what they're doing.
Yes, well, the so-called war on drugs, if you look at its results, will suggest that the war perhaps is not going in the direction that most people would think, insofar as the countries with the largest presence of the United States, of the DEA, of US military training of local troops, etc. Those two countries are Colombia and Peru. Those are the two countries with the largest growing share of export of cocaine to the United States. Colombia alone accounts for well over 90% of the cocaine that's exported to the United States. And of course, Colombia, until just last year, was governed by pro US neoliberal parties that had only seen the situation get worse and worse as more and more DEA troops get into the country. More and more US military bases are established. Colombia has the largest number in South America. Peru is the second largest exporter of cocaine, and that is another country which has had, after Colombia, the closest relationship with the United States, with the second largest number of US military presence and DEA, all of that. Whereas the only country that has seen reductions over the last 20 years in coca cultivation, in cocaine production, is Bolivia. And that's because in 2009, the DEA was expelled from the country. You can see a correlation between where the US is most active and where, in fact, the drug problem is the worst and worsening, I should say, importantly. And Mexico has been, of course, another country on the front end of the US approach, which consists of militarization, of increasing violent conflict and violent repression against rural communities who are involved in, let's say, cultivating coca leaves or marijuana plants, things like this, because of the total poverty that their communities are faced in. Those are the ones that have seen the most violence, state repression, by the fact that they are ones who do not profit almost in any way whatsoever from the drug trade itself. And that United States-led approach of repression first has been what has generated so much violent conflict in Latin America and in the whole of Latin America, and which Andrés Manuel López Obrador has tried to reduce. He hasn't expelled the DEA in the way that Bolivia did, but he has reduced the the physical presence of US agents within the country, and that, of course, has been very upsetting for the United States. But I think for a country like Mexico, it would be very difficult to have a clean break, precisely because they are so close, and the US has such a large presence going back such a long time within Mexico itself.
It is extraordinary how so many of the countries that do much better on drugs are the ones that are, singled out by the US for, special condemnation, like you said, Bolivia or Venezuela, when it's actually the countries that they're involved with the most that seem to produce and export so much. And, one of those countries, as you said, is Colombia. President Alvaro Uribe, was one of the real sort of kingpins in this, actually. In fact, internal US documents identified Uribe as one of the nation's most important drug traffickers and linked with the infamous Medellin cartel. The documents even said he was a close personal friend of the infamous Pablo Escobar as well. And so we have this absolutely bizarre situation where the US keeps saying these countries that are not going along with us are really the problem. But even their own documents show the exact opposite. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the situation with the heroin production right now and the Taliban in Afghanistan, whereby as soon as the Taliban have taken over, heroin production has cratered and gone to the floor. And we're starting to ask, what on earth was the US doing that whole time? And as you said, Bolivia has done a great job of reducing cocaine production. at the same time supporting the rights of indigenous people to grow coca, which is an important crop in Bolivian society that people chew, or I think they even put it in tea sometimes. And yeah, I guess that's the country you might know best out of all of them in Latin America. And since 2020, it's been ruled by a radical anti-imperialist party, the movement towards socialism. Could you tell us what the government is up to there in Bolivia and what life is like there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's of course where I work. I'll be heading back there in the next couple of weeks, and the main priority ever since when President Luis Arce was elected in 2020 was restore the economic damage done by the coup government that was in power for just 1 year, but entirely destroyed the economy in two main ways. One, by freezing all public spending on infrastructure. Almost everywhere around Bolivia, and I traveled around almost every corner of the country, especially during the election campaign. Um, every corner of Bolivia had a big, public infrastructure project, whether it be a road or a bridge, or school, hospital, um, or a processing plant built by this that was being built by the state, but which was then paralyzed. Projects left mid construction, funding totally cut off. That was part of uh, their market reform, their so-called market reforms to shrink the size of the state. But that paralyzation of public investment created a total economic crisis across the whole country, which the focus of the new government of halfway through now, so it's not quite so new, but of President Luis Arce has been to reactivate all of those projects, all of those public infrastructure projects, and that has had a massively positive effect. Bolivia is now back to being one of the fastest growing economies in the region, has the lowest inflation in the region, precisely because of this investment on the capital side, and public investment in increasing industrial capacity of the country and infrastructure. There's been investment as well in state-owned industries, creating new state-owned industries, for example, in processing natural resources, processing fruit, processing even quinoa, for example, for export abroad as value-added products. These are all things that are done with the state leading the charge as state-owned industries. And so recovering all of that process has been a massive job, of course, but is one that has been delivered, and the results in terms of GDP growth, in terms of inflation, will show that. There's been a lot of quite inventive um, policies as well, innovative policies that have managed to combat inflation at a time of a global inflation crisis, at a time when their next door neighbors Argentina are 100% inflation, even Brazil double-digit inflation, Chile double-digit inflation. Bolivia has managed to maintain annual inflation of below 1% last year, and that's because of policies, for example, state-owned warehouses to store production, and which can be released at times where there's inflationary pressure on certain products. Done recently, for example, with chicken. I know I'm perhaps getting a bit too specific here, but when there was a rise in the price of chicken, the state had huge reserves of chicken, which they then sold themselves through the chain of state-owned supermarkets which exists, called IMAPA, at the former price, and that had the result of correcting the price in the rest of the market. So there's a lot of these sort of state policies which would be unthinkable in a so-called free market economy, but which has actually been very successful in Bolivia in keeping down inflation and protecting living standards.
I should add, you mentioned the coup. I should add, just for people who don't know, in November 2019, President Evo Morales was overthrown in a US-backed military coup, which saw pretty much unheralded Senator Janine Áñez take power for 1 year. Áñez brutally suppressed all the demonstrations and opposition against her. But something extraordinary happened there where the people of Bolivia rose up and refused to accept this new government, and they paralyzed the country. And after months of protest, they actually forced this new government into conceding elections. You were in Bolivia at that time during the huge nationwide rejection of this military coup. How was that as a reporter? What was the atmosphere like? Was it dangerous? Was it exhilarating? How was it?
Well, it was very dangerous. It was a dictatorship. It was a dictatorship that carried out multiple massacres upon seizing power. It was a dictatorship that closed down critical media outlets, that had over 1,000 arrests for political reasons. Just sort of remembering those days it was very intense. Let's put it that way. I remember even in, for example, in the region that I was in, called the Tropic of Cochabamba, that I was in at the time. I'm no longer based there, but at the time, which is Evo Morales' home region, and which is entirely took part in a general strike against the coup at the time. As punishment for that, they're actually cut off from banking services. It was impossible to take money out of ATMs, cash points there. It was almost like economic sanctions on the place. And then that was something that only increased. The government then used COVID as an excuse to further repress, to further cut off transport to people, further use that as a pretext to arrest people, to say, oh, well, he was violating the COVID rule. He wasn't allowed out. They weren't allowed out. Using that as a pretext to really repress the population even further. It felt like every day something just awful was happening in terms of a new project being scrapped, a new vital hospital being scrapped, a new person being arrested. Many of my friends fled to Argentina during that time, were given asylum by the government of Argentina, which played a very, very humanitarian role throughout that whole year in providing refuge for people that are being persecuted by the Bolivian regime. And of course, I mentioned earlier the economic crisis that the coup triggered as well, and with their free market reforms. And that is why by the end, the coup president, Janine Áñez, left power with approval ratings in the single digits. And that's part of the reason for the victory of President Luis Arce, who won with 55% in the first round, crushing victory, more than double around double the second place candidate. And it's the total destruction of the social fabric in just 1 year was something that's very traumatizing, of course, for society as a whole, and which is still very traumatizing. And in terms of coming to terms with the violence of that time and the victims who are still looking for justice, still looking for all of those responsible to be held to account and imprisoned. There have already been Janine Áñez herself, who led the coup, is currently in jail, as was another one of the coup leaders, Fernando Camacho. But people point to many others who participated in the coup, participated in the massacres, but who are not yet in jail. And that's, of course, incredibly hurtful for the victims, for the families of people who were killed, almost all of them indigenous people during that period. The two largest massacres, which took place in El Alto and in Cochabamba, Sacaba, Cochabamba. They're still searching for justice. More than 30 people killed as a whole during just the first 10 days of the coup itself. So there's still a lot that the country's coming to terms with. I think the arrest of Fernando Camacho is one of the most important coup leaders. That helped close some of the wounds. That was done in December 2022. But then that has also been a flashpoint for the right-wing opposition, some of which is openly fascist, to continue to try and destabilize the country. But the hegemony that the MAS has, with their victory of 55% in the first round, has dampened the possibilities of the opposition coming back through the ballot box. And there's a level of hegemony led by the movement towards socialism, very similar to that we see in Mexico with Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And so I think this is a project that will have continuity, that will be around to stay. It's going to be part of the Latin American landscape for a long time to come.
And of course, you're reporting constantly on Bolivia with Kawsachun News. Can you tell us a bit more about your work there and where people can follow you?
Yeah. I mean, during that year in 2020, myself and my colleague Camila Escalante saw the need to inform the world about what was going on in English. There was very, very little information at the time. And there was no coverage, of course, by the foreign correspondents based in Latin America who didn't want to shine a light on the human rights abuses that were taking place by the US-backed regime. So we saw the need to try and bring light to that. We set up Kawsachun News, find us at kawsachunnews.com, and to really focus on that and to be a voice for social movements, indigenous movements that for whom the media did not go to at all whatsoever, but who formed the majority of the country and who led the change in government that we saw at the end of 2020 with the election of President Luis Arce. People who change history are the ones who were least listened to, who were given the least coverage. So we sought to correct that. And ever since the victory and the return of democracy in Bolivia, we broadened that out to include to cover Latin American movements, social movements as a whole, across the region. But it's been massively rewarding at times, quite difficult. Many threats along the way, particularly in 2020. Lots of both from within Bolivia and outside Bolivia, but it's wouldn't change it for the world.
Wow. So that's kawsachunnews.com, right?
That kawsachunnews.com, at Kawsachun News on Twitter, and we're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all of that.
Nice one. And where else can people follow you personally?
People follow me on Twitter. I'm still calling it Twitter. I don't know if people call it X these days. Until that cultural shift happens, I'll still refer to it as Twitter. But at Ollie, Ollie Vargas 79. You can follow my colleague who's a co-director of Kawsachun News, Prensa Camila. At Prensa Camila. She's great as well. She's currently in Nicaragua, doing some great reporting there. We hope to be able to be a permanent voice, an ongoing voice reporting on Latin America, particularly the stories that you won't see covered by the foreign correspondents of the New York Times or anyone else.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to speak with you today, Ollie Vargas. Thank you for giving us your time today.
No, thank you, Alan, and MintPress. Great outlet. Of course, during the coup as well, I collaborated with MintPress on a number of pieces and reporting and things. So it's always great to speak with MintPress.
Yeah, with me specifically, actually, I remember those were good times. Yeah. Okay, if you've made it this far, you'll listen to another little plug for our funding drive right now. We have started an Indiegogo campaign, and you can support us there. You can also support us on Patreon. We are completely supported by listeners and viewers like you. So if you are in an economic position, please do consider supporting us that way. If you're not, you can still help us by sharing our content or even just giving it a like and a subscribe as well. Until next week, stay fresh.